About forks. A fork is when one piece attacks two pieces. In this position, the knight checks the king and attacks the queen at the same time. After the king moves to escape check, the knight will win the queen. Every type of unit can fork. Every type of unit can be forked. Sometimes the fork is check, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the attacking unit is weaker than what it attacks. Sometimes it is stronger. Okay, let's have a look at some forks. Okay, here's the pawn fork. Okay, this is not going to work because the pawn will be able to take it. Sorry, the bishop will be able to take the pawn. If the pawn had been defended, it would work. In this position, the knight is weaker than both pieces. Okay, fork. One rook can defend the other, but white will still gain material. Pawns are good at attacking knights because a knight cannot capture a pawn that is attacking it. So here, the pawn forks two knights. A pawn is good at attacking a knight and rook. Pawn forks knight and rook. Pawn is good at attacking two rooks. So rooks and knights are vulnerable to attacks by pawns. And a pawn attack is particularly good because if a pawn forks two pieces, if one moves and defends the other, the pawn will still make a gain. Knight forks are also good because if a knight attacks a rook, king or queen, it is weaker and will make a gain even if one piece moves and defends the other. So knight forks queen and rook, knight forks king and rook, knight forks king and queen, and a bishop forks by going between two pieces on the same diagonal. So here the bishop wins the rook. A knight sometimes forks a piece that can move and defend the other piece. Here white doesn't win material because the pawn is weaker than the knight. Here the queen can fork the rooks, but because the queen is a more valuable piece, as soon as one rook moves and defends the other, it is not safe for the queen to capture. Okay, so there are 7 types of knight forks. So if the king's here, the queen could be 1 square away diagonally. The queen could be this on this square relative to the queen. Could be 2 squares away straight and 1 square diagonally. Could be 4 squares away straight. Could be here, 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 or here. So these are the 7 kinds of knight forks. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the knight goes in and forks the pieces. So another example where the knight forks, but the fork doesn't win material because the king can move and defend the bishop. Okay, so the king moves and defends the bishop. And here's a kind of fork which leads to an exchange. So if a piece forks the king and a piece of the same type, that can lead to an exchange. Sometimes that can be a good thing because it may be favourable to make an exchange. So here the fork leads to an exchange of rooks. Here the rook forks, but either the bishop can move and defend the knight, or the knight could have moved and defend the bishop. So in those situations, the fork doesn't work. Here, bishop forks king and knight. So the bishop goes between the pieces. The rook forks king and knight. The rook goes between the pieces. Sometimes a bishop can fork on two different diagonals. This mostly happens as a result of capture. So here, white wins the rook, even though these are on different diagonals. Sometimes the rook doesn't fork on the same line, usually by making a capture. The reason is because if that pawn wasn't there, the king would already be in check. So, and if the rook had been over here somewhere, it wouldn't make sense to do the fork. You just simply take the knight straight away. So here, the rook makes a capture and forks on two different lines on a rank and a file. So the queen has many ways to fork, but the weaker the piece, the better the attack. So the best things to fork with are pawns and knights. But it's very easy for the queen to do forks, but much of the time they're ineffective because the pieces are weaker units which are defended. Okay, so a queen can fork like a bishop on one diagonal or on two diagonals. It can fork like a rook on one line or on two lines. It can fork like a rook in one direction, like a bishop in another. So there's many ways a queen can fork. So here the queen has a number of forks, so a number of ways of forking the king and the knight. Let's see. Well, not too many ways of forking them, but it can move between them and fork them and win them that way. Another way it could have won them was to move to g2. Okay, so here the queen forks like a rook and moves between the pieces. Here the queen forks by checking the king on a file, and by checking the king on a diagonal and attacking the rook at the same time. So it doesn't fork on two diagonals. So here the queen forks by checking the king on a file and attacking the bishop on the rank. Here the queen checks on the rank and attacks the rook on the diagonal. Notice there's several forks here, but the other ones don't work. The queen could go to g4 where it gets blocked by the rook, or the queen can go to e6 where it gets blocked by the rook. Even the king can fork. Here the king moves up and attacks the two knights. When a knight moves, it changes colours, so one knight cannot move and defend the other. So here, the king moves and forks a knight and a pawn. Here the king forks two knights. Even though the knights are on the same colour, one can't move and defend the other because it takes a knight 4 moves to go from here to here. Here the king forks rook and bishop. There's no safe way for the rook to move and defend the bishop. And sometimes there's ways to get out of forks. Okay, so here the rook forks and there's no way for black to save material. The king can fork, winning material. Now this is interesting because when the knight forks the rook and bishop, there are no squares where the rook can move to defend the bishop. There's no squares where the bishop can move to defend the rook. Now this is an interesting one. The queen forks the two rooks, but because the pawn's in the way, it's not possible for one rook to move and defend the other. So white wins the whole rook. So white wins material by moving right between the two pieces. Bishop cannot move and guard the knight. The knight cannot move and guard the bishop. Now here's a funny kind of fork, because what happens is when the queen moves into e6 check, attacks three things at once. So even though the king can move and defend one pawn, or move and defend the other pawn, it can't defend both pawns at the same time. So white will win a pawn. So here we have a position where white is in check and has three pieces under attack, and the knight's also under attack, but it's defended. But what white can do is move one knight, box the check, and defends the other two attack pieces. So sometimes in chess you have double attacks, where more than one thing is attacked at a time. Sometimes you have the defensive move, which is defends two or more things at a time. Okay, so sometimes a fork can be preceded by a sacrifice. So here, these are lined up. So what white does is sacrifice it. So he gives a check first. And this is a bit more reliable because now when he takes that, it's with check, and he can follow up with a fork. So he wins a bishop out of that. So here white's got a potential fork on this square. We removed a few pieces off the board. He'd be forking the rook and the king. So what he does an exchange, then he does the fork. So sometimes a fork can be preceded by a sacrifice, sometimes by an exchange. So here we get two checks in a row with the knight. So we give a check, king must move, and now we have the knight fork. So here we have a knight fork just by persisting with checks on the same square, even though the check leads to the knight being taken. We'll follow up by forking with the other knight. So if that pawn wasn't there, the queen can go there and fork the king and the rook. So sometimes it's good to just imagine what you could do if pieces weren't there. So what white does, he moves the pawn forward, attacking the bishop. So if black doesn't move the bishop, he'll lose it. So if he saves his bishop, then white's got a fork picking up the undefended rook. So here's an interesting one. Sometimes you can escape from a fork, or you can do what's called a save. What Cecil Purdy, who is the first world correspondence champion, used to call a save. So white's in a pawn fork here, but he takes advantage of the black queen being undefended. So he moves the queen up, and now if the pawn takes the knight, black loses his queen. If the queen takes the queen, the knight recaptures but escapes from attack at the same time. So it's a very clever way to get out of a fork. So sometimes you fork something that's defended. So here the rook attacks the bishop and the rook attacks the rook. So it's like the attacker and defender cancel each other out. So white forks the king and the bishop, and next move he'll win that bishop. So now we've got a fork followed by a fork. So these checks don't lead anywhere. So what white does is, a pin followed by a fork. He pins the queen and then follows with a fork. And here, white sees a way to decoy the king to a square where he can get a knight fork. So he gives up the rook, and now the king and the queen are set up for a knight fork. In comes the knight. So you think this square is defended, but it isn't really, because this rook's going to be tied to this rook after this rook is attacking it. So white does a fork, and even though the knight's not defended, white's going to win the exchange. So here we've got, these are lined up, so we've got a fork followed by a skewer. So white gives the fork, and now the skewer wins the queen for the rook. So even though white loses the rook and knight, he gains a queen, which is like gaining a pawn or more. So now we'll get an easy thing to fall into. We get a sacrifice of a pawn followed by a fork. So what white does is he creates one pawn fork, and even though the pawn's totally undefended, it doesn't matter how black takes it back. Whatever he takes it back with is going to be forked with the knight. So pawn sacrifice followed by a fork. And here's what happens if he takes with the queen instead. Still a fork. And now we've got a knight attacks the king. King defends the knight. Queen moves in as a fork. And next move, white can take the knight. And this is a similar one where the queen forks the king and bishop. It also drives the king away from the bishop. Got the two rooks fork king and bishop. Now, black looks like he's pretty solid. He's got a lot of pieces there defending his king. But white gives a knight check, taking advantage of the queen pinning the pawn to the king. King must go in the corner. Now he follows up with a knight fork. So here, queen is defending the bishop. So what white does is he drives the queen away from being tied to the bishop. So it doesn't matter what black does now, is going to lose material. If the queen takes the rook, knight takes the bishop, making it a fork. So we have a sacrifice followed by a fork. So white sacrifices the exchange followed by a fork. So white wins the bishop. We have, now this is a funny one, we've got the queens are attacking each other and the white knight is defending this queen. And the black knight is defending this queen. But it's white's turn, so he's got this funny move where he destroys the defense of the queen. So he's threatening queen takes queen. So black hasn't got time to take the knight. So what happens is, if black takes the queen, he regains the queen with a knight fork. So in the process, white wins a knight. Okay, so I've got potential knight fork here. So white does a queen sacrifice, then does the knight fork, so white wins the exchange. Mind you, the other move would have worked as well. Okay, so potential knight fork on this square. So it's good to imagine what could you do if pieces are off the board. So white sacrifices the queen, pinning the queen in the process. Queen takes back, white forks, regains the queen, and in the process white has won a knight. Okay, so here white wins a humble pawn. He takes the pawn and black takes it back, and white regains the queen with a knight fork, in the process winning a pawn. So here we've got queen attacking queen, king defends queen, queen's in a pin. So we don't swap queens, that wouldn't lead anywhere. We just do the knight fork, then later on we swap queens and take the rook. And in this position, you imagine what could you do if the queen wasn't there, and then you can see this great knight fork. So if you move the queen to a check, probably the king would move or something, but what you can do is you can take the bishop, and then the square has been vacated for the knight. So white regains the queen with a knight fork, in the process has won a bishop. So here we go, so we get a fork followed by a fork. So white does a knight fork, and now does a queen fork, picking up the undefended rook, thanks to the h-file being open. Okay, now, even though white's in check, he meets the check with a check, and the check wins the queen. And here's a funny kind of fork, because the piece that makes the fork, so the queen gives check, is not attacking the rook directly, but it is indirectly, because it's lined up behind the other rook. So after the king moves, the rook will win the rook. Okay, so that was an example of some basic forking patterns. Okay, so thank you for watching.